Hi, my name is Alexander Biscardi, and welcome to the first episode of Pure Cinema Podcast. Each week, I will be reviewing a different film and mostly talking about what goes into the process of making these films, with an emphasis on the visual storytelling in each film. I'll also be talking about every department that goes into making a film, and such as the wardrobe department, the music department, hair and makeup, and a lot of these things that may go unnoticed to the general viewer, I want to, show appreciation for and kind of show how the story can be told through all these different departments. And so I think really the true sign of a great film is when every single department brings their A game. And, whether it's the wardrobe, the music, the hair and makeup, the set design, every single thing is evolving with the story and reflecting the story, and every single one is just bringing their A game. So this week I will be reviewing a film that I think is the greatest film ever made, or at least easily one of them, and that film is The Godfather. The Godfather was released on March 24th, 1972, and it was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It was produced and distributed by Paramount Pictures, and obviously the rest is history from here. However, many people might not know that although The Godfather did turn out to be a great success, it didn't have such a great production and actually was expected to be a flop, and pretty much just went through an absolutely miserable production, but we'll get into that in a minute. So I'm going to start every episode off with a pitch, and this is for if you're someone who maybe hasn't seen the film that I'm talking about on a certain week. This is me telling you why I think you should watch this film. So each week, if it's a film that you are not familiar with, please watch at least the pitch segment of the video, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you to go watch the film, and then after that, check out the episode. So the pitch for this week. The Godfather obviously does not need that much of a pitch. Any greatest of all time film list that you're going to look on, it's going to be in the top tier, most likely one or two. It's really just influenced so much of cinema ever since it came out. Prior to The Godfather, gangster films were typically, the gangsters were always these kind of dumb, tough guys, not very intelligent. And once The Godfather came out, it was the first film to show characters who were typically the dumb villains in a more intelligent and sympathetic way. And really in The Godfather, these characters who are gangsters are portrayed as, family men and men with codes. So this was totally groundbreaking at the time. I mean, nowadays in 2022, we've obviously seen much more amoral characters portrayed as the protagonists, but a lot of that really comes from The Godfather. And, it was coming off of the 60s, which is probably the worst decade in film history, where the Hollywood studio system just kind of got played out. After the 60s, people were craving, new stories, kind of like a lot of what was going on in European cinema, mainly in France and Italy and Japan. And so The Godfather was following films like Bonnie and Clyde and kind of took that amoral characters in as the protagonist to a whole new level. Okay, so let's start by talking about the director of the film, Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola was hired because they wanted an Italian-American voice to present the film with a certain level of authenticity, which had never been seen before. It was actually very rare up until this film that you would see real Italian-Americans cast as the Italian-American gangsters in the film. Actually, interesting fact, one of these exceptions was the great Richard Conte, who was an Italian-American who played multiple gangsters in films of the 50s and the 60s. And in this film, he's actually cast as the main antagonist, Don Barzini. And he gives, of course, an incredible performance as always. One of his great performances of the studio system era is a film called The Big Combo. It's a very low-budget film, but it's beautifully shot by the great cinematographer John Alton. And if you're into just gangster films and film history, I highly recommend checking that film out. Coppola was hired because he had recently done a film called The Rain People. And in this film, the studio saw his ability to get good performances out of his actors, so they trusted him to make the film. They also hired him because he was a young kid, and they thought that he would be easy to manipulate and be more of like a puppet director for them. They soon learned that that would not be the case. So Coppola actually had no interest in doing the film, but his company, American Zoetrope, was bankrupt at the time, largely due actually to George Lucas's first film, called THX 1138. The Godfather is based on the best-selling novel by author Mario Puzo, who actually didn't have much knowledge of organized crime, but did a lot of research and wrote his story that way. A 30-page treatment had been written by Coppola for the film, and the way they did the writing of the film, it was co-written by Francis Ford Coppola and the author of the book, Mario Puzo. So Coppola wrote the screenplay, Puzo gave notes, and then they collaborated to get the final draft that we know today. So the studio actually suggested that they set the film in Kansas City and make it a modern-day 1970s film, because that would make it cheaper and easier to shoot, because they were just trying, to make this another movie in the assembly line. Coppola heavily fought this, and the World War II aspect of the film is actually such a crucial part of the film, and the character of Michael Corleone, clearly the war, although it's not directly addressed, has had an effect on him and his mindset, and although they lead up to this big kill when he kills Sollozzo late in around the midpoint of the film. Michael's actually killed before, and this is briefly, there's a throwaway line with Sonny where they mention it, but because of this war experience, that's why Michael reacts so calmly in these situations, and he has that leadership, fearless quality because of his experience in the war. Kind of is what really actually paved the way for Michael to become the ruthless crime boss that he became. So setting it in the 70s, obviously, you would lose that whole World War II aspect of it. Another relation to World War II is the famous wedding scene in the beginning, where it's just a super light, happy mood, which obviously the rest of the film does not keep that same tone. But we have this very bright tone because it's, in a way, all these people are celebrating the end of the war. This is set in 1945, and the war's just ended, so the mood in America was absolutely sky high at the time. So there really is so much of an element that World War II plays in the story. So Coppola definitely did the right thing by insisting that it be set in New York in 1945. Okay, so next let's get to, obviously, the star of the film, the legendary Marlon Brando, who plays Don Vito Corleone, the lead of the film. Now, briefly, I do want to mention that there has been debate over who's the real lead of the film, Marlon Brando or Al Pacino, playing Vito or Michael. So a lot of people will argue that Michael is the one who is the lead of the film because Michael's arc is really the core of the film, where Vito doesn't really develop as much as a character. He's mostly more of the same character from start to finish. Obviously, we see him age and we see him kind of calm down with age, but Michael's arc is the real core of this story. However, at the Academy Awards, Brando was listed under Best Leading Actor, which he won the Academy Award for, and Al Pacino for Best Supporting Actor. This is actually because, although Al Pacino as Michael does have more of the arc in the story, all of the key turning point decisions that drive the narrative all come from Vito. So the first Act 1 turning point is when Vito makes the decision to decline Sollozzo's offer. Sollozzo wants his connections to help him with his drug business, but Vito doesn't want to get involved with drugs, so he declines them. Later in the film, the Act 2 turning point also comes from Vito, because that decision is when he says he will, forgo all vengeance as long as Michael can return to the country, and that's where we move into the third act. So all of the key turning points in the narrative of the film do come from Vito's decision, which is why he's the lead. So, although Marlon Brando at this point was considered to be the greatest actor ever, and you could still argue to this day that he is the greatest actor ever, and obviously legendary performances such as the great film On the Waterfront. But at this point, Brando's career was in great decline, and he had developed a reputation for being difficult to work with. So the studio did not want Marlon Brando, and even told Coppola that if he mentioned Brando's name again, he would be fired. Where Coppola then pretty much, as the story goes, had a spaz attack and fainted to the floor. I don't know exactly what went on in that meeting, but he made a big scene. And they told him Marlon Brando could do the film under 3 conditions. 1, he does the film for free. 2, he had to put a bond down in case that he threw any tantrum on set, he would lose money. And 3, he had to do a screen test. So obviously Brando did not end up doing the film for free, nor was there the whole bond in case of the tantrum on set. However, Coppola did go to his home and record a screen test. And he said it was literally just incredible to watch how, you saw Marlon Brando. He was like, he had the long hair at the time, and just as they were talking about this character, Coppola claims you could just see Brando just fully transform, and, he put cotton in his mouth, which is another famous story from this film. And he kind of just, he adjusted his collar and just really just slowly transformed into this character, which is just another example of the genius of Marlon Brando, who is easily one of the greatest actors in the history of cinema. And so, one brief story to let those of you who are maybe not as familiar with Marlon Brando know about the genius of Marlon Brando is, people talk about, acting in this era, acting in that era, but I think truly just when you're a great artist, it's the mentality behind the actor or actress that makes them so great. And although techniques change, styles change, some people were truly just brilliant actors, and Marlon Brando is one of them. So one story I always loved about Brando is they say when he was in acting school, they said to everyone, pretend you're a chicken and the world is about to end. So all of the actors, of course, as you would expect, are just running around, acting like chickens, going crazy. And Marlon Brando just stood there silently squatting. And someone said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm a chicken. What do I know about the end of the world? So I think that just goes to show you the mental process behind Marlon Brando. Now, another actor who the studio surprisingly didn't want is the legendary Al Pacino, another all-time great actor. But he only had one credit to his name at this point, and it was not a notable one. The studio did not at all want Al Pacino. They actually wanted someone like a Robert Redford for the part of Michael Corleone, but Coppola thought it was very important that Michael be played by an actual Italian-American. The studio was ready to fire Al Pacino any day, and he actually sprained his ankle in the first week of production, which made matters even worse. And it seemed like after that first week of shooting, he would be fired. But Coppola actually, the famous scene in the restaurant where Michael kills Sollozzo and Officer McCluskey, Coppola moved the shooting of that up to the first week, because he knew that would be able to showcase Al Pacino's acting and help win the studio over, which luckily it did, and he was able to keep his job. I can only imagine what the film would be like if they hadn't casted Al Pacino, and although Robert Redford's an incredible actor, one of the all-time greats, still I don't think he would have been as perfect for this role as Al Pacino, who is a real Italian-American. Another great actor in this film is Robert Duvall, who plays Tom Hagen. Tom Hagen is an adopted son of Vito Corleone, who is the lawyer for the family. He runs a one-client practice where he only deals with Vito's affairs. I think what he really did such a great job with in this film is the rhythmic way he speaks. He speaks in a very kind of educated, rhythmic way where he constantly is using the word if. Almost every time he speaks, there's always an if or something where he's making sure to not fully incriminate himself. And just really pulls off like that lawyer persona. So then we have the great Jimmy Caan, who plays the oldest son, Sonny Corleone. James Caan had a pretty established career at this point, and the studio had no issues with him in the film. Although he isn't of Italian descent, he still just is a great actor, and no one obviously minds because he's just such a great actor. And he's really, the hothead older brother, which James Caan captures perfectly. Then you have the sister Connie, played by Talia Shire, who some also know as Adrienne in Rocky. And Talia Shire is actually the sister of Francis Ford Coppola. Then we have Diane Keaton, who plays Kay Adams. And Kay is a total outside of the family. She is Michael's girlfriend and later wife. And Diane Keaton is also famous for many films with Woody Allen. And she kind of really captures that kind of WASP culture that originally Michael wants to be a part of. But as the film goes on, he loses that. And one thing I think they do a great job with Kay's character is the wardrobe of her character in the beginning is these very elaborate colors, like bright reds, very noticeable. You could always pick her out of a crowd due to her wardrobe. But as the film goes on, we see her wardrobe become darker and darker, kind of as she's becomes more of like a background housewife in Michael's life rather than what he desires. I think really, though, one of the biggest strengths of this film in terms of casting is what a great job they did with all of the supporting roles. I guess the first one we should talk about is Sterling Hayden, who is a phenomenal actor, had an incredibly successful career decades prior to the making of this film. He worked with Stanley Kubrick multiple times on films such as Doctor Strangelove and The Killing, and he plays Officer McCluskey and totally captures like this tough guy, corrupt cop. Did a phenomenal job. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we have Richard Conte as Barzini, one of the first ever real Italian Americans who played Italian American gangsters in film. And then shout out to South Philadelphia legend Al Martino, who plays Johnny Fontaine, who is a Frank Sinatra type of character. Frank Sinatra actually hated this film because he hated the portrayal of a character who everyone watching the film, especially at the time, was thinking this is Frank Sinatra. And so one famous scene where he says, Godfather, I want the part in the war movie. So that is a reference to the 1953 Academy Award-winning film From Here to Eternity, which I highly recommend. It's actually one of my personal favorite war films, where Frank Sinatra gives a phenomenal performance that totally revived his career. However, the mob didn't actually get Sinatra that part. The truth is, Frank Sinatra's wife at the time, Ava Gardner, was working on a film with one of the producers, and she was the one who got him that part, which angered Sinatra even more because it made people think a false story about how he earned the role in that film. Then we have Richard Castellano as Clemenza, someone who doesn't get talked about enough, and actually in the second film he wanted an insane pay raise apparently, which is why he doesn't appear in The Godfather Part 2, but he just feels super authentic as, an Italian-American crime captain. And there's so many Italian guys anyone who comes from a traditional Italian-American family probably knows a guy like Clemenza. Then we have Giovanni Russo, who plays Carlo, another very authentic performance, who did a great job. And as we're going down the list, you can see how much more authentic it is that Coppola really did go out of his way to cast real Italian-American actors, something that even today a lot of films portraying Italian-Americans don't do. Then we have Abe Vigoda as Tessio, and it's funny because for myself and I guess a lot of people around my age, the first thing a lot of us saw Abe Vigoda in was Good Burger, the Nickelodeon film starring Kenan and Kel. But I just always thought that was funny that once I got old enough to see The Godfather, I'm like, it's the guy from Good Burger. So The Godfather had a 62-day production, which Coppola described as absolutely miserable. The crew pretty much had no faith in him. They were pretty much ready to abandon ship any day. But Coppola said that he spent most of his time focusing on the actors and working with the actors. And clearly, it paid off. So when this film was edited, they had two editors working on the film. Each edited one half of the film, the first half and the second half. The studio actually told Coppola the cut must be no longer than 2 hours and 15 minutes. And so Coppola delivered the cut, and they said, you cut all the good stuff. So then they added it back to 2 hours, 40 minutes, and then it eventually became the 3-hour epic that we know today, which I just can't picture this film being shorter. So the film was shot by cinematographer Gordon Willis, and as it said, Willis really didn't have much trust for Coppola. Coppola was a young director at the time, and Willis didn't really think he knew what he was doing. Coppola said that he constantly was requesting for 2 cameras on set, which Willis did not approve of. Willis believed in shooting with 1 camera and 1 camera only. So that also angered Willis. Another thing that angered Willis greatly was in the wedding scene when Michael's talking to Kay and really explaining the dynamics of the family to her. That scene was actually shot at night because they had just run over schedule and everything was behind schedule. So that scene was actually shot at night, which Willis was furious about, they say. As far as Willis's style, he famously loved static shots. He didn't like fancy tricks or anything like that. He didn't really like to move the camera. And I think that definitely shows with The Godfather. And since it is set in 1945, him and Coppola decided to not use any modern filmmaking techniques and make it seem like a film that could have been shot in 1945. And I think that definitely comes across. As far as camera movement, there's really very little camera movement in this film. And a lot of the camera movement is just very small and unnoticeable moves, like maybe a slight pan with this character as they stand up, or as the character moves, like we just pan with them, but very unnoticeable camera moves. Nothing like kind of like the flashy, fast-paced Scorsese camera moves. This is a very, static composition film. So next, I want to talk briefly about the hair and makeup, mainly for Michael Corleone. So throughout the film, you could see Michael's development through just his hair. In the beginning, Michael's hair is, it's not gelled. It's just kind of, it's brushed, but it doesn't look like he really did a lot with his hair. By the third act, it's totally slicked back, shiny, and he totally has that, that Italian-American stereotypical gangster look of the time with his slick back hair. So just if you look at the pictures just through Michael's hair, that alone you can see the evolution of his character. So I always say, if I were to tell you the top 3 most important things in film, in my opinion, it would be number 1, music, number 2, music, and number 3, music. I think it's easily the most important part of every film, and that's where the real emotion comes from. I think every scene that I've ever really felt this strong emotional connection to has had great music, or it's been a lot of music playing, and then that cutting of the music is what drives that emotion. But overall, I just think music is such a vital part of film, and The Godfather picked my personal favorite composer, Nino Rota, who Coppola had to go to Italy to find to give it that real authentic Italian sound. So Nino Rota scored many films in Italian cinema throughout the 50s and 60s, many for my personal favorite director, Federico Fellini, and also for the great Luchino Visconti. And also he scored the 1969 adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, which is one of his more well-known compositions here in the United States. And Nino Rota's music just does absolutely so much for the film. There's, of course, the iconic Godfather Waltz, and then the beautiful music of all of the Italy scenes, such as the Sicilian Pastore and the love theme with Apollonia. And, I mean, so much of the success of this film, I think, is thanks to Nino Rota. The production design was done by Dean Tavoularis. Apologize if I butchered that name, but obviously the production design of The Godfather was done very well as well. It's mostly darker lighting and kind of darker sets. A lot of the sets are, darker woods and darker colors, which really helps create that mood of the film. The wardrobe was done by Anna Hill Johnstone, George Newman, and Marilyn Putnam. And the wardrobe we're going to talk about numerous times as throughout this episode, but I just think that the wardrobe in this film was one of the areas where they really excelled. Commonly, it's a lot of, suits and, like casual suits in the house where, the buttons are undone, a lot of vests, a lot of suspenders. How people dress when they were wearing a suit and then they get home and kind of unwind a bit is, I think, what makes up the bulk of the wardrobe. But they do a great job with using the wardrobe to tell the story. Another example with Michael where they do this is how in the beginning you see Michael wear mostly brown colors and trench coats, and by the end he's wearing these real sharp suits, darker colors, and totally evolves from dressing like a upper middle class, upper class civilian to a gangster. Also, it's worth noting that the camera was almost always 4.5 feet high, rarely looking up and down. Not really a lot of high-low angles. It was mostly just kind of at the same height for most of the film. Most of the film was shot on around 40mm lenses. And I think that definitely helped them, speed up production where they weren't constantly having to change the setups and change the lenses and all that. Being that this was a very stressful production, I think that was a smart decision by Coppola to help speed up the process. And although The Godfather has some incredible imagery and some great cinematography, a lot of the film is actually really just, medium close-ups of actors speaking and kind of just cutting between them. It's not quite, the Fellini, Kubrick, every frame is a painting type of film. A lot of it actually really does come from the performances, and although there is some great cinematography in the film, a lot of the shots are just simple, medium close-up shots. But you kind of just get carried away from the performance that if you're someone who pays attention to cinematography, you're not really bothered by kind of this more basic coverage. A part of that is because they do a very good job in cutting between these, and just when you have a cast that's this incredible, that's all you really need is you can just kind of let the performances go and carry the scene, which they absolutely do in this film. So, although Coppola was chosen as, this Italian-American director to take on this project, before him, they actually considered other directors such as Arthur Penn, who famously directed Bonnie and Clyde, and Elia Kazan, who famously directed films such as On the Waterfront and East of Eden. Arthur Penn actually was someone who Coppola greatly admired and greatly influenced the Sonny murder scene at the toll booth, which has many similarities with the end of Bonnie and Clyde. The producers paid very little for the rights to this film and had very low expectations. Coppola is not happy with depictions of Italians prior to this film, and as he claims, he didn't like Italians who, as he says, talk like it is. And so he made sure that these portrayals of the Italians were not stereotypical. And when Coppola joined onto the project, he said, I don't really know anything about gangsters, but I do know what it's like to grow up in an Italian-American family. And although this technically is a gangster film, it really is a family drama about gangsters. And I think a big reason why, especially many Italian-Americans such as myself, love this film is because there's so many relatable aspects to Italian-American culture throughout the film. And just, it has that super authentic atmosphere of what it's like to be a part of an Italian family, which really humanized these characters and is what made them so likable to the general audience.
Now let's get into the actual scenes of the film. So, we open up, the very first character we see is Bonasera. So, it's actually not until a couple shots into this scene when we get the master shot, which traditionally would start off a scene where, they have the wide master shot and then cut in. However, here we start with a close-up of Bonasera's face. And there's clear, very intensity in his eyes as he tells this horrible story. And this is just a brilliant way that Coppola opens up the scene, because from the very beginning, he's creating questions in our head. In the very beginning, for the first couple seconds, we don't even know who he's speaking to. He could be speaking to a jury at a court. He could be speaking to the police. There's a lot of different people he could be speaking to other than Vito Corleone. For all we know, in the beginning, Vito could have been the one who sent these men to do this action. And so by doing that, he's constantly creating questions. And then we get eventually pulled back to the reveal of Don Corleone in just an over-the-shoulder shot, and simply he just does this hand gesture and sends someone, which automatically is showing us that Vito is someone who's running the room, and he's a man of power. So, I think this scene is brilliant because this whole dynamic between Bonasera and Vito really is showing two sides of the Italian-American, the American dream for Italian-Americans. In the beginning, we see Bonasera, where he's telling this very vivid and horrible story about how his daughter was beaten and he had to see her in this brutal state. So at the end of the scene, the Don agrees to give Bonasera the justice for his daughter, but in exchange would like a favor later in life. Now, I think it's safe to assume pretty much everyone watching this is like, this poor guy, he's going to get caught up in murder, or his life's going to be screwed. Something bad is going to happen to Bonasera, and he's going to regret this favor. However, that's not what happens. The scene is actually foreshadowing later in the film where Sonny Corleone, Vito's oldest son, is gunned down brutally. And Vito now has to see his child in that brutal state that Bonasera described his daughter. And so what you see here, and then Vito asks for that favor, and it's also a total 180 of, the tone and contrast. In the first scene, we have this very warm lighting in a darker room, where in Bonasera's next scene, it's this very strong white, like a hospital lighting. Very strong white light. Total contrast of what we saw in the beginning. And the favor he asked of Bonasera is he asked him to do all his powers to heal Sonny. And I just think this is brilliant because what we're seeing here is the honest man asking the criminal for murder and the criminal asking the honest man to heal. And it's really just showing these two sides of paths that different Italian Americans took, and both of them needing each other. And I just think that was a very subtle, brilliant thing that a lot of people likely don't notice. And just back to the first scene, in the very beginning, we see Bonasera very strong in the frame with the strong close-up, the intensity in his eyes. But as we pull back and he's no longer talking about how he believes in America, he's talking about how America has failed him and the American system has failed him. He becomes very small in frame and a lot less powerful in the frame. And it's just, with this one just small or slow dolly back, it really is just reflecting what's going on in the dialogue so well. We finally see the Don for the first time when Bonasera whispers that request in his ear, which we don't hear it, but instantly he declines. It's also worth noting how the film reveals so much of Vito's character by how he reacts to the story. Most people who hear the story are probably going to think, oh, that's horrible, I'm so sorry this happened to you, but Vito's first instinct says, why'd you go to the police? Like, why didn't you come to me first? And I just think that alone, the first line we hear from him is so revealing of Vito's character to set him up for the film. Also, in terms of sound design, it's a super quiet scene. There's no music. Obviously, before this, we have the quieter score in the Godfather waltz. But then once the scene begins, totally silent. We hear, a couple creaks in chairs and a couple birds outside chirping, but that's really it. It's a very quiet sound design for the scene. Once we show the master shot, that's when Bonasera asks how much will he pay him, and that's when we see Sonny and Tom there, totally changing the dynamics because we see both of them backing up Vito, and it kind of traps Bonasera in the frame. Now, had we opened up on this shot, it would have totally changed the way we look at the rest of the scene. But because in the beginning of the scene, we don't even know who Bonasera is speaking to. Then we know he's speaking to the Don, but for all we know, it's just the two of them in the room. So Coppola waits to reveal the dynamic, and he's constantly changing your perspective on the scene by the way he reveals the information, rather than a more standard way of filmmaking, which would have been to just start with the master shot, show the dynamics, and then kind of just let the dialogue play out. So I'm personally a big fan of, cutting out with scenes rather than cutting in, and I think this is just a masterclass example of that. Also, once Bonasera kisses the hand, that's when we cue the score for the wedding, and they'll use a J-cut, which, for those of you who don't know what a J-cut is, a J-cut is when you hear the next scene before it starts. The reverse of that would be an L-cut, where the sound or music of one scene carries over for a little bit into the next scene. And these are often used, to patch transitions. So then we go to the wedding, and the main purpose of this scene is really just to introduce the characters and the world. It's very exposition heavy. They do it in a very fun way with this very upbeat music. I think it's worth noting how they use the lighting with the characters. So for this scene, Vito's trapped inside. We even see the one shot where he's looking through the Venetian blinds, and he's stuck inside while everyone else is out having fun. And he's in the dark, in this very dark room. The total opposite of that would be his wife, who doesn't play a huge role in the film, but she's up on stage, she's in the bright sun, all the eyes are on her, and it's kind of showing how everyone's looking at the good side of the family, and, the glamour and the wealth of it, but then there's obviously the darker side, which is what Vito has to deal with on the inside. And we're constantly in this cross-cutting between the wedding and Vito's meetings. We then see a meeting with Enzo the baker, which really serves to kind of just show what it was like, some common struggles for Italian immigrants at the time, along with just how Vito deals with this and how he does help some people. And here he's helping Enzo get into the country, but this will also later set up the Enzo character, who will become an ally to Michael in the hospital scene later in the film. Also in the film, something that goes kind of unnoticed is we are introduced to Don Barzini in this scene. Many people probably don't pay too much attention to him, and they have a great, I call them PC moments, which is a pure cinema moment, and that term comes from Alfred Hitchcock, where he called pure cinema anything where you could totally understand the story without a word of dialogue. You could have the film muted, and it makes perfect sense, where Barzini comes, we see Vito shake his hand, and then a photographer who's just going around taking pictures of the wedding as a typical wedding photographer takes his picture, and Barzini has the guy crush the film, which is a pretty funny moment. But when you rewatch the film, you realize, because before then it's set up that Bruno Tattaglia is the one who has the beef with Vito, but Barzini, we later find out, was the one behind it all along. And when you rewatch the film, you realize, like, you don't even see Bruno Tattaglia in the film, but Barzini, Coppola as a filmmaker points your attention to Barzini early in the film, setting him up as an antagonist, even though we don't know it in that moment.
So the way they deliver exposition through Vito throughout the film is pretty much he says something, and then normally it's Tom will ask a question, which then is answered. For example, this would be when he says, we'll discuss that when you get back from Los Angeles, and then Tom says, I'm going to Los Angeles. Also, then later in the film, another example would be when he said, Barzini's a man who will already understand that, and he's like, you mean Tattaglia? And he's like, nah, Tattaglia's a pimp. It was Barzini all along. So that's one way of delivering. Another way that delivers this exposition is through the character of Kay, where they have a character who is an outsider to the family and doesn't really know anything about them. So that provides a chance for Michael to pretty much explain it to her, which is essentially explaining it to the audience. They also, of course, foreshadow him becoming the Godfather, where they have the family photo. Originally, they set up for it, and Vito won't take the picture without Michael, which is already building anticipation for Michael before we see him, and it shows the Vito's care for Michael, who is clearly his favorite child. And then later, when we see the picture, Michael is the one who stands out because they're all in suits and Michael's in his military uniform. And then takes it a step further, dragging Kay into the picture, who looks even more out of place with this bright red wardrobe. That basically visually kind of foreshadows that he will become the Godfather by doing the reverse of it, because he's the one who stands out, which draws our attention to him. This scene was shot over the course of 2 days. There was a lot of pressure on Coppola at the time from the studio. He felt like he was going to lose his job any day at this point. As I mentioned before, the Mike and Kay scene was shot at night. And here's where Coppola really added a lot of intricate details of Italian-American culture from his own personal experience. An example of this would be when you see the little girl dancing, standing on Tessio's shoes, dancing. That was a memory from Coppola's life, and Coppola actually insisted on having the presence of kids a lot in the film because Italian Americans, especially at that time, typically very large families, so there were constantly always, kids in the picture because there were just so many people in the family, so someone was always having a kid, and he always remembered the presence of kids everywhere, so he insisted that they be present in the film, although playing no major role, just as atmosphere to the film. Another thing that just frequently, although it's not in this scene throughout the film, is there are a ton of crying babies in this film. From the scene at Sonny's, after the assassination of Vito attempt, to the baptism, to after Carlo beats up Connie. There are so many crying babies in this film. Another way that they show Vito's favoritism towards Mike is when Michael first enters, we see Vito watching him through the Venetian blinds, and there also is this very romanticized jazz score, and that just creates a certain mood as we're watching this scene in Vito's perspective, which really shows how he has this admiration for Mike, which we later find out that he has these huge goals for Mike to be a senator or a politician or someone who is even a more powerful man than Vito himself. And another thing I should probably mention is that Vito is mostly inspired by the gangster Frank Costello, who, although was a gangster, had a great admiration for high society America and preferred to hang with, he had many political connections, such as Vito in the film, and preferred to hang with, high society America rather than his fellow gangsters. In this scene, we also get our first taste of Sonny's rage, where the FBI's outside, which shows, how high-profile gangsters these guys are, where they're taking the time to write down license plate. And then you see Sonny break the camera, and just the little details, like the fact that he throws the money on the ground, just as like a sign of disrespect towards the FBI, and how he spits before that. Just those little things that don't really involve a word of dialogue reveal so much character for Sonny. So we see him as, you know, the angry one. Then we see Fredo, who is just clearly totally hammered and not very socially aware. And so then we kind of introduce Fredo as, you know, the dumb member of the family. Tom, from his conversations with Vito, we pretty much figure out that he's, you know, very business, very lawyerly, as I mentioned before. The mother is totally removed from, as I mentioned, all of the gangster stuff, and she's actually very far apart from Vito. And, you know, just the authentic portrayal of Italian-American culture and family in this scene really helps just to humanize the characters and help win audience support. So then, after we've seen 2 meetings with Vito, we see him inside talking to Tom, and all of a sudden we hear these loud screams of girls outside. And this is our first introduction to Johnny Fontane, played by Al Martino, who it was inspired by Frank Sinatra. First, he goes out on stage and he sings, and we see this total admiration. He's the star of the show. All the girls are totally in love with him. All eyes are on him. He sings a beautiful number. And then right after that, Vito comes out and walks him back. And as soon as he sees Vito, he whispers something in Vito's ear. And Vito says, we hear Vito say, I'll take care of it. Where we see like there's the sense of urgency in whatever it is that Fontane wants. So now we get into the office. There's a big contrast between how we saw the last 2 people, Bonasera and the baker, in Vito's office compared to Fontane. Fontane, who is Vito's godson, he's also in a bright white tuxedo, and he's sitting on Vito's desk, which shows a level of closeness with Vito that the others did not have. And now the guy who seconds before was the star of the show on stage is now super weak in the office with Vito. He's almost helpless. And this really shows you, once again, the power of Vito Corleone as a character, because Johnny Fontane, who is, you know, one of the biggest stars in the world at the time, and he's just totally, like, breaking down to Vito, who then says, act like a man. And then we have Sonny enter the room after we've seen Sonny cheating on his wife. And for this shot, as Vito speaks to Johnny Fontane, they keep Sonny in the background out of focus, where he says the line, and he kind of gives like this look back towards Sonny before he says it. He says, you know, a man who never spends time with his family can never be a real man. And they keep Sonny in the background of this shot because although he's speaking to Johnny, he's actually really speaking to Sonny. And a lot of those comments are really directed at Sonny and show his disapproval of him cheating on his wife. And throughout the first act, we see a lot of very subtle disapprovals of Vito towards Sonny, and we get the sense that he really doesn't trust him as to be the Don, to succeed him as the Don. And really the core theme of this film, which Coppola talks about, film about the succession of power, and he really saw it as this kind of Shakespearean epic. We find out later in the film, after Sonny's passed away, that Vito did think he was a bad Don, which is also why, you know, it ends up needing to be Michael. Johnny Fontane's request also will then move the story forward into the next scene, Los Angeles, which we'll get to in a minute. For this one of the 3 requests that we've seen, this one, Vito sending his top guys. For Bonasera, he says, you know, send Clemenza because he wants the job done right, but not because he really cares about the job. The second request, he says, you know, give it to the Jew congressman, not our paisan, because he, once again, doesn't really care about this. But this one he sends Tom on, one of, you know, someone super close to him, because this is important, and it once again shows Fontane as a more important character to Vito. Now we get to the Los Angeles scene. This scene is, I think, incredibly well done. To start this off, we just get a lot of, and these were shot by the second unit also, where just a lot of extreme wide shots of the whole city, and basically it's just this huge city, and then we see the studio with Waltz's name on it, and all these people working within the studio who are employed by Waltz. And pretty much it just shows this incredible scope of Los Angeles as, you know, a symbol of power and how many people it employs, and just what a big mountain, I guess you could say it is. And then we just see constantly this super small guy in the frame just walking through, who is just like any other guy who'd walk by him, never notice him. And because he's representing Vito, this is the ultimate show of how powerful he is, where another filmmaker might have, you know, had this scene where he comes in, like, real intimidating or something like that. But this scene Coppola plays it super calm and just shows this small guy in this, incredibly powerful studio and town who really holds all the power because he's the one who has the power over Waltz, who is the one running the show. And, we're introduced to Waltz. He's got the girl around, his arm around the girl. He's got this real elaborate suit that would totally draw the eye in any room. And, once he's there, he already knows Tom's there. And, he throws like a bunch of racial slurs at him because, he's a man who can disrespect anyone and get away with it. So then, after that first meeting, then we re-cue the big band jazz score we saw earlier. And then once again, we see them moving through Waltz's mansion where they're once again very small in the frame. And there's a big emphasis on the environment because the environment in this scene is so much more powerful than the characters, as you would think. But then we soon will find out that's later. And then Waltz, even when they're walking through, makes a comment saying like a palace fit for a king. Once the movement through Waltz's house finally stops is when we introduce his horse, which has like this real nice, wardrobe on it that's clearly expensive. And he talks about the super expensive horse. And, this really shows that the majority of people in LA would, because he's just such a small guy walking through the environment, have no clue who is actually really running LA. And so this scene, once Tom has dinner with Waltz, is the first real test of power that we've seen in the film, where obviously everything prior, Vito was clearly always the most powerful character in the scene. But now, as it seems, Vito might have met his match, where Waltz says he can't give him this request. And, Waltz is pretty confidently tells him, and he says, I'm not no band leader. And it's the first real test of power for Vito. But we see Tom react super calmly and just kind of very politely. And then, once again, we go back to that grand environment, super quiet with crickets in the early morning. And it just slowly builds up. And so one thing Coppola actually changed from the book here is, in the book, the horse head, which, by the way, is a real horse head, they actually literally went to a horse farm where they breed them for food and picked out the horse that they wanted to use for the film. And in the book, the horse, he wakes up, the horse is on the post of his bed. But they change it here to be in his bed, and I think why it works so well is because if it's on the post, he wakes up, he sees the horse, that's that. But because it's in the bed, there's this slow, first you kind of see he turns, then you see a glimpse of the blood, and then as he takes the covers off, it's revealing more. And it just creates the suspense and quick anticipation buildup that you wouldn't have had if it was just right there, because what can you really do? You could have panned to the horse's head, but the way it's slowly revealed by just revealing more and more blood by unfolding the blanket creates much more anticipation and makes it a much more brilliant and suspenseful scene. The first Los Angeles scene, I counted 9 shots and 11 cuts. Then, once we go to Waltz's home for the exterior, I counted 7 shots, 8 cuts. Once we get to the dining room, 6 shots with 14 cuts. And I'm pretty sure, by the way it is, I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the scenes where Coppola did use 2 cameras, just the way it cuts between them. I think this is likely somewhere where Coppola did have the privilege of using 2 cameras. And then once we get to Waltz's bedroom, where there's the horsehead scene, there was 6 shots and 7 cuts, including the 3 cut-ins on the screen, which I think is a brilliant move where we cut the score. Also, producer Robert Evans hated the score in this scene. He felt that the score got ominous too soon, and he wanted to kind of wait to use the score, but I disagree. I think it was done phenomenally. After the horsehead scene, there's this silent pause with a slow dissolve to Vito, who is obviously the man who's pulling the strings, and like we mentioned, all these people we showed employed by Waltz, who really is, in a way you could argue, works for Vito. Now we're in the scene, and one big thing in acting is that with actors always think of is, where am I coming from? Where's the place from? So in this scene, Tom's tired from LA, but time to move the story forward. Now there's real business to attend to, and now we're going to see the first real threat to Vito. Obviously, to the average human being, a man like Waltz is a serious threat, but now we're going to see someone who really is a threat to Vito, which is Sollozzo. So, during this exposition, they make it a little more interesting by having Tom describe Sollozzo as we see him entering, where we see a couple pure cinema shots of Walt's entering, where there's this shadow up the steps, and just the little details, like the fact that the steps he walks up are these iron steps, which have a certain sound effect, which creates a certain mood for our introduction to this character, which pretty much indicates that he's going to be an antagonist. Also, here, Vito asks for Sonny's opinion first on drug distribution, and we see Vito doesn't say anything in response to Sonny's answer, but we see kind of a look of disapproval and disappointment that Sonny thinks, well, there's a lot of money in that white powder. But Tom then also, although he agrees with Sonny, gives a very educated response. But then when it comes time to hear Vito's response, there's a brief pause, and then we just cut to Sollozzo's pitch, creating more questions in the audience because we don't know what Vito's going to say going into this. So this is one of the most crucial scenes in the film, and this is the scene where we'll move from the first act into the second act. In the beginning, so one of the major beats in this scene is when Vito gets up and comes closer to Sollozzo when he rejects his pitch. And just that small move just also totally changes the dynamic of the scene, rather than if Vito had just simply stayed there for the entire discussion. Also, just the wording he uses when he says, I must decline your offer, he said, but I'll give you my reason, is Vito also basically saying, I don't have to tell you, but I will tell you. And basically implying that he should be thankful that he's even getting a reason for why he's being declined. So the real major turning point in this scene is when Sonny speaks out. As Vito's talking to Sollozzo, Sonny kind of jumps in. This is actually really the one action that leads to Vito's assassination, which sets the entire story in motion. All comes from Sonny speaking out in that one moment. And after that, Coppola emphasizes this, where if you watch the movie muted, you wouldn't know what Sonny said, but you would know it's important because they cut around to every single character's reaction to that moment. Also, there's the Vito, the hands up, kind of says, shut up. But that one moment is really, honestly, the most crucial part of the entire film. If it wasn't for that, Michael might not ever end up becoming the Don. It literally sets the entire story in motion because that's when Sollozzo now knows Sonny is interested. So if we could take out the Don, we could figure out how to work with Sonny because he does have some interest. And once again, this is another action of Sonny's, which disappoints Vito greatly. As far as sound effects for this scene, there's a typewriter in the background and, some loud footsteps. And so this scene was shot on location at a real olive oil company in Little Italy. And it was also the first scene that Marlon Brando shot for the film. The studio hated his performance. Coppola went and reshot it against the studio's wishes. What we got as a result turned out great. I don't know what the original looked like, but I think likely Coppola made the right decision here. The studio actually hated this first version of the scene so much that Coppola almost lost his job over it. And they were actually grooming another director to take his place because they did plan on firing him. And Coppola fired 4 crew members who, including the AD, who he considered traitors who were kind of reporting back to the studio, talking shit on him. And so then after the meeting, Vito obviously calls out Sonny's actions. And then after that, we kind of wrap up the Johnny Fontane LA story where he gets the flowers and it creates this kind of comedic beat in between. And then Luca Brassi's called in to move that story forward. And so for the anticipation for the Sollozzo meeting scene, we have 5 shots with 11 cuts. There's 1 exterior shot of Genco olive oil, and then we have 2 in the office, 2 shots, 2 cuts. But then once we get to the actual meeting, we have 11 shots for a whole 30 cuts. Now we get to Christmas Day. We open this up with Michael and Kay on Christmas Day because this is the day that will really transform Michael's life and change it forever. Although he doesn't fully have his transformation into a gangster on this day, this is the day where he's a different man at the end of this day than he was in the beginning. This is also shown through Michael during the day, where he's good guy Michael, versus at night, where now he's kind of questioning what he wants to do going forward. Coppola's compared this to a Shakespearean type of film, and I could definitely see maybe some influence from Romeo and Juliet, which uses both day and night metaphorically throughout the entire play. And here Coppola kind of uses that day and night with Michael. And here we just overall see a reversal setting. And what I mean by that is Christmas is typically, a positive, happy family setting. And this day is pretty much no good news at all for the Corleone family. It's just bad thing after bad thing, and nothing positive really happens on this day. Also, in the beginning, as far as wardrobe, we see both Mike and Kay are wearing matching colors. They're both wearing brown. That will not keep up later in the film, where their wardrobes will change very much. As far as set design, everywhere you go, there's Christmas decorations. And another thing we see in this scene is when Vito's getting ready to leave before the assassination attempt. Paulie, who's the driver, he's not there. And we see Fredo stick up for him. He's like, Paulie's a good kid. And in that very moment, we don't really think anything of it. When you rewatch it, that shows Fredo doesn't really have the best judgment as a character. He sticks up for a character who actually was selling the Don out. So then we go to the murder of Luca Brasi, who goes to the Tattaglia family, and we see Sollozzo there. But there's some brilliant foreshadowing here where when he walks in, there's the shot where we see him walk in, and through the glass, and in the foreground on the glass is the image of a fish. And as they choke Luca out, he kind of sinks down. We go back to that shot, and he sinks down to where the fish is. And obviously we know the famous line, once the family finds out about the murder, they send the fish. It means Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. Now this scene is super quiet, a very echoing sound. You could hear a pin drop in this room. They really just create this quiet tension. And as I mentioned earlier with the Santino comment in the Sollozzo meeting, just one great thing about The Godfather is how the smallest detail and the smallest behaviors have just such an impact on the story. When Luke is meeting with them, just the one, when he puts his head down to spark a cigarette, that one look the one gangster gives the other gangsters is subtly, and it's still this very calm tension, and subtly just super quick, rapid action out of nowhere, which this film does multiple times, where it's just calm, and then just picks up real quick like that. The action just happens so quick, and I think it's definitely one of the great mob hits in cinema history. And so for this Luca Brasi murder scene, we have, for the walk-up, we have 3 shots, 3 cuts. And then once he goes inside the bar, we have 9 shots with 32 cuts, which kind of shows you how the cutting really does pick up once there's that action happening. And then we go to the attempt on Vito Corleone's life, where we have, street jazz playing in the background, kind of just like a regular New York street. Also, there really isn't that many New York shots in the film, although it's set in New York. It's a lot of interiors, a lot, at the Corleone compound. There are very few shots that really, scream New York. Also in the background, you could see a fight poster for Jake LaMotta, who is the lead of the amazing Martin Scorsese masterpiece, Raging Bull. Although this film came out 8 years before Raging Bull did, so that wasn't even a thought in Martin Scorsese's head when this film was made. And also here we see, Fredo bobble with the gun, and also reveal Fredo's character, where as soon as the Don shot, he kind of just hugs him and cries, where if that had been a character like Sonny would have likely, ran after them and been shooting at the guys who shot his father. But Fredo just kind of really doesn't know how to react, which is another very revealing characteristic about Fredo. I really think this kind of stays with Fredo for the rest of the film. You could see he has a certain level of guilt over it, and it bothers him throughout the film, but we'll get to that later. And so for when there's the assassination on Vito's life, we have 12 shots for 22 cuts. So then we go to Sonny's house after the murder attempt, and at this point we think that Don's likely going to die. We don't know that he's lived yet. And there's just a super unsettling atmosphere the entire time, and there's just so much uncertainty in the minds of the characters, which you really feel as an audience member. They have, once again, that crying baby atmosphere that Coppola uses multiple times in the film. But also that crying baby, while setting the atmosphere for the mood of the scene, also shows, what's at stake. They could be coming for Sonny next. Sonny has a family to protect. So the family is super nervous in this scene, and it totally shows in it. Also then, Clemenza knocking shows, how it's kind of has a Fort Knox almost atmosphere. And we once again see the rage from Sonny when he pins Clemenza up against the wall just for suggesting that Vito is dead. Then Sonny gets the call from Sollozzo saying that they have Tom Hagen. I think they do a great job showing visually how much tension there is in the room, how Sonny just he writes on the cabinet because he's just so rushed for any kind of information because there's so much uncertainty in this time. There's a diner where Sollozzo talks with Tom and basically convinces them to take the deal, and convinces them that he has no other option, really. And this scene, when they filmed it, there was a brutal storm outside, which they were really worried about, which once we go to the exterior shot, you can see. And there's actually only 3 shots in this scene, but a total of 23 cuts. I'm guessing that day they likely just wanted to keep it moving quickly because they were worried about the storm, so they just kept it to 3 shots. But the master shot is really great, how there's this, it's an over-the-shoulder from behind one of the gangsters, but he's totally silhouetted on the left side of the frame, but you don't really notice him. But what it really does is, traps Tom Hagen, who's very small in that shot. And I think that's definitely one of the better shots of the film. Then we have where Mike finds out about the attempt on Vito's life. And here we kind of move past the newsstand in the foreground, and then Kay's reaction when we get to the other side of that. And then after that, we see Michael call Sonny. Here we have this tight shot where you see Kay separated from Michael on the other side of the phone booth, and this is the first time it's really becoming between them. And what Kay really represents is, Michael's chance at a normal life. And now there's that separation between them. Also, there was not actually really a newsstand there. They moved that there themselves, the production team. And then when Mike arrives at the house, we get the only shot that really travels through rooms as like this kind of freely moving shot, which you don't really see in this film, but we do get that one there. And just another example of the attention to detail, once Mike enters the room with Clemenza, just they have all Christmas cards all along the wall, and they easily could have just had that be an empty wall, but just putting that there, even though no one notices it, does so much just to change the atmosphere of that scene, which shows, how important these little things such as set design really are to a film. So then we have everyone in Vito's office discussing it. Paulie gets a close-up when he walks in, and this kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone, because when he enters, it's moving the story forward for them finding out about Luca Brasi, but it's also giving him a chance to enter, which gives Sonny a reason to talk about him, to provide the exposition that he's the one who sold him out and they need to kill him. We see Tom super relaxed and exhausted. Sonny's very lean forward, ready for action, and kind of how these characters react is, further characterizing them. And we also see, the way the shots compose. Mike divide between Sonny and Tom, who are kind of like the 2 different philosophies on how to deal with this issue. And then once we find out Luke is dead, they cue kind of these bass strings, which really do a great job creating the mood for that moment. And for this meeting in the office, there's 8 shots with 26 cuts. So then we begin the next day, and there's some really great just realism in this scene with small details, such as, you got the kids playing in the street kids are playing in the street right next to a guy who's about to be murdered with just absolutely no idea. And then the talk like, don't forget the cannolis, setting up, obviously, the famous line, leave the gun, take the cannolis. And actually, for the drive, when they drive to kill Paulie, that was actually stock footage that they used, which is why it doesn't really match great. And they use voiceover dialogue for it. And we see Paulie very tense in the beginning. He doesn't want the guy sitting behind him, but from the dialogue we hear throughout the ride, they're making jokes and kind of loosening him up to let his guard down. And then, of course, we get the murder of Paulie, which we cut out to a very wide shot for. And this is actually my favorite shot of the film. Just the way they have the framing within the frame in this scene. I just think they did a phenomenal job with that one shot, where it happens on screen, but it's also kind of, you're at a distance from it. Very visual, and that's easily one of my favorite shots of the film. Also, after Paulie's murdered, there's a gas coupon from World War II on the windshield of the car, which Coppola just put in there as a time-accurate detail. So then after Paulie's murdered, we dissolve to Michael, because now Michael, the emphasis is on Michael, and, that life of murder will soon become the reality for Michael, who doesn't know it yet. So we see him outside alone, then he goes inside, and, we get some good Italian realism, like Clemenza teaching him how to make gravy, which was a recipe from Coppola's family. So then he goes to dinner with Kay. And this is a super important scene, because the way they shoot them in separate shots, and there's a lot of empty space and empty chairs in their shots, which kind of shows that they're not connecting in the same way that they were before. And There's another great example of attention to detail is if you look at what Kay's wearing. She has this elaborate dark red outfit on, and her hair is very, nicely done, where clearly she went and got her hair done for this dinner and put a lot of effort into her appearance for this dinner, where Michael is clearly just not focused at all, and his head is totally elsewhere. But just those little details, like how much work was put into Kay's hair for the scene, shows, how much she cares about Michael and how serious she takes this relationship. Also, another thing notable about the scene is the way music's used in this scene, which really it's used to show the silence of it. It's not, although it does, yes, create a mood, it kind of is, you're noticing the music because you're noticing a gap in the speaking between them, and it's really used to show the silence between them. This is one of the only areas of the film where they use lyrical music, and it really does a great job of, showing the silence when you're hearing the lyrics of the music and not them speaking to each other. And so this dinner scene, we only have 3 shots with 9 cuts. So now we get to one of the most crucial scenes of the film, the hospital scene, which has 20 shots with 41 cuts. We can see Michael's entry shot be secretly reused when he leaves. And I just think one of the great ways they create atmosphere here is there's just this emptiness. The set design is perfect with this real ugly, uncomfortable green. It's just a totally unsettling atmosphere. You have that looping end of the record sound just over and over again. The fact that there's a sandwich that's mid-eaten, where clearly it's as if someone was in the middle of eating it and then got kicked out right in the moment with little time to, finish their sandwich even. Just the fact that it's not even like crumbs. It's literally a half-eaten sandwich with multiple bites in it. Just really does reveal so much. This is the scene where Michael is tested as a character, and we see how he reacts when, the stakes are. He just totally takes control of the situation, and this is where we really see Michael's leadership abilities be tested and really come out. For example, when Michael needs the nurse's help, he doesn't ask her for help. Michael simply takes charge and just runs the scene and does what he needs to do to make sure his father is safe. And the stakes are obviously very high. We know what the stakes are. His father's life is at stake. And so this is great use of just simple filmmaking where they use the end of the shots for just those empty hallways and the footstep buildup, which this is actually a suggestion from George Lucas, who's a great friend of Coppola, who they work together very closely, especially at this time. And I love how there's this big buildup of the footsteps, and then it turns out to be an ally, which subverts your expectations. And then we move outside, and there's the scene where they drive by, and this scene's been talked about many times by many film commentators, where just the small action of getting a cigarette out of a pack reveals so much, because that's when you see Enzo's hand shake and Michael's don't. Because Michael is calm in the situation and he knows how to handle himself there. Even Michael is taking notice of this. And then we introduce Captain McCluskey, which they do a great job of, where it's the thunder, he comes out of the shadow, and there's that very dark lighting, which I think they do a great job of just setting the tone for his character. Although I do notice one error in the scene where in this shot you could see rain, and in this shot there's no rain, and Michael's totally dry, but I'm not here to nitpick, it is what it is. Also, this is the scene where we really see Michael going from a passive character who kind of just is reacting to things to being an active character who he's actively making decisions and driving the story now. Also, once McCluskey punches Mike in the face, they picked a great sound effect here. Legendary sound designer Walter Murch worked on this film, and the punch that McCluskey throws is just, it sounds like it hurts like crazy. It just sounds they used the perfect sound effect for that moment for sure. And so once we're outside the hospital, we have 18 shots with 45 cuts. So then the next day, security is very up at the Corleone compound, and they talk about Sonny is using now more aggressive tactics. But then, unexpectedly, once we see Sonny, everyone has been in this pessimistic mood, and Sonny's super happy and upbeat. He's like super cheerful. He's almost like enjoying this war. And once again, we see here Michael is still wearing, more civilian clothing rather than gangster attire. And this is the scene where he really, once again, takes action and wants to get even more involved than he already has. So then we get the basement scene where Clemenza pretty much prepares Michael for this dinner hit. And once again, I think this is another area where they do just a great job of set design, having, the paint cans, the tools, religious pictures, old books, and just really create, a great atmosphere through set design that just feels very authentic, and it feels like a full room rather than a common mistake some people make early in their careers with set design is just having a very empty spaces. And this film, the set design, definitely knows how to fill those empty spaces and make these environments feel very lived in. And so for this meeting in the office, we have 13 shots and 26 cuts. So then we have the scene of waiting for the location. And this is a very tense, no music. We have 10 shots and 27 cuts. They said Coppola was very distinct about the Chinese food containers as set design, because it was based on a memory of his, and he was very specific about that. Also, once they finally do get the location, the way they shoot the scene is it's a wide shot on everyone, and Sonny just kind of goes into the background without cutting, and then walks back up the Z-axis. So another major great PC moment here is when Michael reacts to getting the call. So once they confirm the location, you see Michael just lean forward, because now what he's about to do is actually becoming a reality for him. And he doesn't say anything, but just that small gesture really does reveal so much. And then we get this very romanticized score with the goodbye between Mike and Sonny, which when you watch it second, third, fourth, whatever time, you realize this is the last time that they're ever going to see each other. And it's this super emotional moment, but then we get a quick dissolve with, the dramatic score beat change to that tense kind of bass key score that we get for repeated throughout this next sequence. Before that, we get that real romanticized score, which is heavy strings. Also, in terms of wardrobe, everyone's pretty dressed down except for Michael, who's in a full suit. Clemenza also wears a suit, but his is, very loose, where, all of them are like Sonny's in a beater, Tessio's in a vest, but Michael's the only one who's really in a full suit. So then we see a car pick up Michael, and that gives us another brief, putting questions in the mind of the audience, because we don't know who Michael's getting in the car with. And then we reveal Sollozzo in the car, and then we also reveal Captain McCluskey. And both of them are kind of over the shoulders of Mike, so they can't see Mike's face, but we can, which creates a certain amount of irony. So when they shot this scene, the car wasn't actually moving. They just had lights on strings that they were moving to create the illusion of it. Once we see the Jersey sign, that creates, an element of suspense, because now we as the audience in Michael's shoes are getting nervous, just like Michael is. And another thing that makes this upcoming sequence so great is how an entire playbook for what Michael needs to do at the restaurant is laid out for us. So we as the audience know Michael's entire plan going into this, and we're just waiting for him to execute and wondering if everything will go as planned, just like Michael is in this scene. And so for the drive to the restaurant, we have 13 shots, which is a lot for a car scene, and 31 cuts. Then we get to the famous restaurant scene, which consists of 19 shots and 59 cuts, which is one of, if not the most cuts of any scene in the film. Many would argue this is the best scene of the film. Super crucial to the entire story, and this is right before we get into the midpoint, turning point. So basically, in this story, Coppola creates such great suspense because we see Mike kind of executing as plans going, but there's little things changing, like when he asks to go to the bathroom, he doesn't really ask politely like they had told him to. Then there's they wait a minute before he finds the gun, and we're like, is the gun really going to be planted there? So they're constantly creating that suspense by slightly altering the plan, just as, it would likely go in real life. I love how the scene starts out with just that tense pause where Sollozzo and Mike stare at each other as the wine's poured. And the way it's shot, it's a lot of over the shoulder between Mike and Sollozzo, with McCluskey kind of has his coverage off to the side because he's really not that important here. The main thing is between Mike and Sollozzo. And, there's a lot of, drawn out atmosphere. And then Coppola creates even more questions by having the two of them speak in Italian without providing us with any subtitles. And this is clearly intentional because later in the film in Italy, he does provide subtitles. So by not giving them to us here, it's creating even more questions in this tense atmosphere. And so this scene was actually shot on days 3 and 4 production, like I mentioned earlier. They moved it forward to prove to the executives that Al Pacino was a very capable actor. So this scene, it's basically just a lot of cutting back and forth, not much camera movement up until Mike gets the gun. Also, once we arrive at the restaurant, they introduce the sound of the train, which will come back as a very important sound effect. And I think one big thing about this scene is how there's really no plot twist. I think in modern day film, the filmmaker would feel a need to have some sort of plot twist here, but everything goes as planned. But because we know the plan, we're constantly wondering if it will go as executed, and those slight alterations really make us even more nervous. So although Michael does execute the plan, another one of those alterations is how he doesn't drop the gun right away, which everyone then is kind of waiting for him to drop the gun. So there really is no plot twist, and it's really just some great Hitchcock-style suspense. And so after speaking Italian, Mike switches back to English after looking at Officer McCluskey, and because clearly now this is something that he wants him to hear. And here we really can see just the tension in Mike's face and an anger in his voice. And this is where Mike starts, deviating from the plan, because now Mike's emotions are kind of taken over a little bit, because you can tell he's still very angry about the McCluskey situation. Also, the underlying tension here is, Mike fought in World War II. He fought to protect people. So him, who clearly believed in the American system, is disappointed. Seeing a corrupt cop like McCluskey likely angers him even more, which is never directly addressed, but I think that likely is part of the psychology behind how Mike feels here. And also, as far as set design, there's so many empty tables. You do see people in the background having dinner, most of them along kind of the perimeter of the restaurant, but it's a very empty atmosphere, which also adds to another layer of tension. Also, in terms of the hair and makeup department, the job they do with Mike's black eye, where it kind of has that purple around, and then it becomes kind of like a yellowish bruise under the eye. I think they really did a phenomenal job of having like that next day black eye that Mike has, which is also a reminder of us of why he's so angry with McCluskey, and just another visual reminder of what Mike is thinking in this moment. So then Mike goes to the bathroom, super tight atmosphere, and actually, that was the actual bathroom of the restaurant. However, the flush chain had to be added by the production team. And then once Mike comes out, he kind of walks into the over-the-shoulder, and he kind of takes a pause. And this is where we hear that the second train, and then he comes over, and he sits, and he doesn't come out shooting like we expected him to, which really creates some suspense. So now we get that train. Now this train kind of builds up to that highest volume point rather than the other two train sound effects. This time, now we get a dolly into Mike, and his eyes were super still before, but now we just see rapid eye movement, really helping us getting into the mind of Mike. And then he stands up, takes the shot, and there's like a brief ringing sound effect right after that first shot. And then there's kind of like, as far as the art department, like a red mist shoots out from behind Sollozzo's head. And then McCluskey, the way he gets shot, he's got like the fork midair, like literally like in shock as it happens. And he kind of, he's choking, so he suffers a little more before he dies, which I guess is kind of like payback for his actions. And so as far as the train, there actually was a real L train by the restaurant, which then inspired the idea to use it to elevate this very intense moment. And I think another thing that makes this mob hit so great is that it's very earned. We see Mike struggle with the plan. It's justified because we already don't like Sollozzo because he's involved with drugs. He has less morals than Vito and attempted to kill Vito. And we don't like McCluskey because he's a corrupt cop. So we're rooting for Mike because he is the most honorable character up to this point. We haven't seen his war background, so we haven't seen him kill anyone. And even if we did, he's killing people serving the United States Army in World War II against Hitler and the Nazis. So this kill is very earned, which is part of what makes it so great. And because of all the way it's built up, everyone is really in Mike's shoes in this scene and rooting for him to pull it off. And then Mike drops the gun, and there's this super loud horn. I think it's honestly probably the loudest instrument we hear in the film, just for this super dramatic beat that takes us to the midpoint of the film. And so, due to time length, I'm going to end the episode here. But don't worry, next week I will make sure to cover the second half of The Godfather Part 1. So I hope you enjoyed. Please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and tune in next week for the second half of The Godfather Part 1. Thank you for watching.